All right, Iris, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Hi, I'm Iris Jacobson, and I'm a consultant on the special education team at DPI. My area is specifically under the category of intellectual disability, and I always say all things alternate. So that involves the alternate assessment and standards. And also, I work part-time on the assessment team, assisting with accessibility for our statewide assessment.
And I'm Rose Kilmery. I'm also a consultant on the special education team at DPI. I focus on specific learning disabilities and specially designed instruction, and also consult on accessible educational materials. All right, Iris, I think you're up first.
Sure. So the title of our presentation is Normalizing Accessibility. And interesting, as I kept going through the slides, I'm thinking, well, we're far from normalizing, but we're going to make a big shot at it, right? And but how it normalizing it in general would be, from the voice of the student lens, if it's normal for them, right? So think about that for the student as we go through our discussion today. So I think of normalizing too as being part of universal design for learning, right? And I did a presentation on universal design, and the more I dug into it, how universal, again, is not very universal, right? Because universal means it's everywhere all the time for everybody, right? In that kind of a layman kind of thinking. But we are striving to be universal. The more universal we can get, the better it is for all students, including our students who don't have disability related needs that need additional accessibility features to access their education. But anyway, we really want to think about, learner variability being the norm. I mentioned the student voice is going to be so important. Constructing meaningful goals and flexibility. The flexibility in our methods and means is a big part of UDL. Aligning UDL guidelines to all what we do in the classroom. And then operationalizing the whole piece of equity, making things accessible. Thinking I always use this little, if you see my hands or my picture, there's, we tend to design systems for this group, but we need to push out the RV extensions, right? And include all our students when we think about designing our systems. So that's kind of an thinking way of how we want to think about normalizing accessibility and using UDL as a part of it. We can go to the next slide. So both things need to happen. You have to separate the goal from the means, right? AEM is not it's not teaching to read. It's providing access to the content that a student may have to read, right? Or access to the text that's being presented. We need to continue to teach to read in addition to providing access to content at grade level, right? Both would need to happen in your goals and your services. So therefore, if a student is behind grade level in reading, they should have access to the content at their grade level. And in addition, we should be having some SDI and teaching them how to read from the point that they're at their present level and moving them forward. And that second bullet point on there is the qualification for tools like Bookshare is linked to the disability status, right? So that's a nice big yes there. So I like this. I believe Kathy may have shared this with me. So many people share things with me that I'm sometimes forget where it came from, or it may have been not Kathy White, but the UDL folks have shared this little graphic. If so, in the example here shows text to speech, right? If the access is text to speech, and the student is not using it, there's no benefit, right? If there's text to speech and the learner does not need it, but uses it, it really had no benefit. But then when you think of text to speech in the context, the student needs it and used it. Now we have benefit, right? So that they can really show us what they know and are able to do through that. And so one issue with universal design, I mentioned before, it's not truly universal in practice despite its name. The term universal implies that it should work for everyone in every situation. But in reality, it may not fully address the diverse needs of all individuals that we encounter in our days at school, right? So the design principles might be broadly applicable, but they can still fall short in effectively meeting the specific needs of every person, especially when applied to a one-size-fits-all situation. The discrepancy underscores the importance of thoughtful, personalized approaches. So effective implementation of universal design requires careful consideration and matching of individual features to ensure that each person's unique needs are met. So build that mental muscle with your students, right? That they're practicing and using the accessibility features that they actually need and are using, and then we have benefit. So accessibility every day, I've kind of mentioned these things already, including the student voice. How often are we asking the student, is this working? How are you using it? What do you like about it? What do you don't like about it? Just casual conversation periodically could be helpful if you don't have a formal way to include the student voice. Integrating AT into the IEP, we're going to discuss that a little bit. Rose is going to share some ideas with that. And then making sure it transitions to our post-secondary plan. Again, I want to talk about the student voice portion. If you're going to have accessibility every day, then you really need to include that student voice in selecting the AT and using the AT, and monitoring the progress of how it's going and what might need to be changed up. We want to review all the sources under with a student. We want to make sure we feature matched it well. We want to make sure they're advocating for themselves, that self-determination piece. We want to make sure, like I said, that the student, we ask those questions for the student. And who is in control of the feature, right? It's not all about compliance. It's about who really needs it. Going back to that visual that we had in the previous slide. If the student really needs it and uses it, we actually see the benefit. And now I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Rose to talk about how to integrate this how to integrate AT into your IEPs.
Yeah, thanks, Iris. Well, first we're going to hear from our participants out there. Where do you put assistive technology in the IEP? Go ahead and just drop in the chat any ideas you have for where AT might show up in an IEP. Things, supplementary aids and services, in the goals, special factors, right out the gate. Somebody said all the sections. All right. So yeah, actually, I would agree that AT can be recorded in several sections of the IEP, including the present level and the annual review of the goals, the special factors, the disability-related needs, the goals. If the disability-related need is the students need to learn to use that assistive technology, which we'll talk a little bit about in a few moments, supplementary aids and services, program modifications or supports for school personnel or staff who may need training, and even the post-secondary transition plan. So we're going to go over each of those areas of the IEP with assistive technology in mind. I want to reiterate the importance of prioritizing and documenting the use of assistive technology for students with IEPs who need a feature, even when it's available to everyone in a given environment, like Iris had mentioned a few minutes ago. That's so important that that's tied to the effects of the disability and the disability-related needs, and documented so that it's guaranteed for that student. So in the present level, be sure to clearly describe the student's abilities and barriers to learning, include data that was collected during the assistive technology assessment process, and review any current AT services. The team can discuss why the effective services work, as well as determining whether additional concerns need to be addressed. And in the description of the student's functional present level of performance, be sure to describe data around the use of the accessibility feature. So that could include information about how AT features are working or documentation of the procedures being followed by staff. That's important when we're getting to progress reporting, which is the next portion of the IEP that we'll talk about. So there should be a place for progress notes about the use of assistive technology. So typically, I mean, as a teacher who focused on learning disabilities, frequently my progress notes were about, academic progress. They're reading this many more words per minute or doing this skill in math, but there also need to be progress notes about how AT is being used. Those progress updates could include information about whether or not the feature is working for the student as the team intended. And that's an area where student voice can definitely be centered. The student can provide valuable information about things like user preferences or the variability of the user's experience. So when thinking about user preferences, you can ask questions like, does the student like the tool or feature? Does the tool do what the student wants or needs it to do? Is there a preferred tool maybe that could be an option to explore? And then in terms of the variability of the user experience, the questions like this could be helpful. Is the feature more helpful to the student under certain circumstances or in specific settings or situations than in others, right? Because you want to discern if there are barriers in some contexts to the use of that tool, and if those barriers themselves need to be addressed directly, or if there are other tools that might just be a better fit in different situations. All right, this portion of the IEP where special factors are documented. So IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, requires IEP teams to consider the special factors that are listed on the slide. The team has to determine if any of those factors are relevant for the child, and if so, address the factors in the child's IEP. And you'll notice that the last dot point is assistive technology. So it is required for IEP teams to consider that. In the special factors section of the IEP forms, this shows up as a yes or no question, I think, on all. It might depend on the vendor, but certainly the program summary will go into greater detail about the amount and frequency and duration of services. So it's not necessarily sufficient to just check, yes, the student needs assistive technology. More information needs to be included in the IEP. All right, let's talk a little bit about disability-related needs. So in Wisconsin's College and Career Ready IEP Step 2, the IEP team identifies the effects of the disability so that they can summarize the student's disability-related needs. And those DRNs link to goals and services, which could include the student learning how to use the assistive technology and services for providing the assistive technology. So when we think about those annual goals and the use of assistive technology as a related service, it's important to remember that related services are required to assist a student with a disability to benefit from special education, specially designed instruction. And the specially designed instruction relates directly to the goals. So the assistive technology equipment or feature itself is not the outcome. The equipment is a means to an end. The focus should be on that outcome. It should be on the goal, and that can be academic or functional. So these next couple slides, and I'm going to say Michelle Silverman and Dommer Johnson are here, and I'm pretty sure that these next couple slides come straight out of what they presented in September, but it's worth repeating. We broke it up into 2 slides instead of 1 for the purpose of today's discussion, but I definitely want to give them credit for how much we borrowed from them. So in terms of specially designed instruction for AT, we're going to look at SDI and then the supplementary aids and services. and how those could be documented in the IEP. And in these examples, the area of impact is communication. There might be another area of impact that a team discusses and has to document. But let's imagine that we are developing an IEP for a student who has a goal about increasing their use of multimodal communication. And the IEP includes instruction in the use of that assistive technology to assist the student in making progress with that goal. So that would require specially designed instruction. And then supplementary aids and services are aids, services, or other supports provided in general education classes or other education-related settings to enable a student with a disability to be educated with students without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. So with that italicized part in mind on the upper right there of the slide, supplementary aids and services can address the areas of communication noted on the slide. These are just some examples, things like dynamic display speech generating devices or AAC software or eye gaze, right? Again, if a team is considering another area of impact, there would be some other accommodations or modifications listed there. But the point of these last few slides overall is that students can receive, in addition to having supplementary aids and services related to AT listed in their IEPs, they can also have specially designed instruction so that they can utilize that AT effectively. And then there's a section of the IEP about program modifications and supports for school personnel. And those are services or activities needed by school personnel to meet the needs of the student. So that could include training or other supports for teachers or paraprofessionals or other school personnel. The graphic on this slide represents how a student's academic and functional needs and their overall success are supported by high quality service delivery, which is informed and shaped by coaching and training. So take care not to overlook assessment accommodations also when you're developing this section of the IEP. Simply describing accommodation on the I-7 might not be enough. The IEP team has to consider the training that staff needs for how assistive technology tools will be used and how to set them up. So overall, again, coaching and training and service delivery supports our student outcomes and its success, and no program modification, or sorry, no accommodation can be overlooked in that, in terms of making sure that our staff are sufficiently trained to serve that student. And then the last part of the IEP we'll consider today is post-secondary transition planning and transition service. So feature matching and everyday accommodations definitely can support transition planning. Make sure that the students' AT needs are communicated so that they can be carried over into those other environments related to post-secondary transition. This is an opportunity to teach students to self-advocate for their needs in other environments. So again, we're talking about amplifying student voice, centering student voice, and we're thinking about normalizing accessibility. This is accomplished in part by ensuring access in all environments. It's not just something that happens in certain places. So definitely keeping post-secondary transition planning in mind is an important part of this. Iris is going to talk a little bit more about universal tools and accommodations in UDL, I think as it relates specifically to assessment, and maybe a couple other topics too.